The warning that changed everything. The soft hum of conversation filled the elegant restaurant, a place where the wealthy and powerful often gathered to enjoy their meals in quiet luxury. Chandeliers hung overhead, casting a golden glow over polished mahogany tables, and the aroma of gourmet cuisine drifted through the air. At a secluded corner table, David Kensington adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy blue suit as he studied the man sitting across from him. Ryan Calloway, his business partner and best friend of nearly 20 years, was scrolling through his phone, barely looking up between half-hearted responses to their conversation. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, the finalization of a billion-dollar deal that would launch their company, Kensington and Calloway Enterprises, into an entirely new league. "This is it, Ryan," David said, picking up his glass of expensive red wine. "We've worked for this moment our entire lives." Ryan finally looked up, flashing his signature charming grin. "We have, haven't we?" He clinked his glass against David's. "To the future." David nodded, taking a slow sip before setting the glass down. "I'm going to step away for a moment. Order whatever you want." Ryan smirked. "Don't worry, I always do." David chuckled as he stood, making his way toward the restrooms. His path took him past a waitress balancing a tray of dishes with practiced ease. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She had been working at the restaurant for over a year, always keeping her head down, efficient and professional. But tonight, she hesitated for the first time in her career. Emily had overheard countless conversations from the wealthy patrons who frequented the establishment. She never listened intentionally, but sometimes it was unavoidable. And what she had just heard sent an icy chill down her spine. As David disappeared down the hallway, Ryan casually leaned back in his chair and answered a call. His voice was low, but Emily was close enough to catch every word as she refilled a nearby water glass. "Everything's set," Ryan murmured. "David has no clue. Once the deal is signed, I'll have controlling interest in the company. By the time he realizes what happened, I'll be CEO, and he'll be left with nothing." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The words cut through the air like a knife. She nearly dropped the water pitcher, her grip tightening as she processed what she had just heard. This can't be right. Ryan and David were more than business partners. They were practically brothers. She had seen them dine together at this restaurant dozens of times, laughing, toasting to their success, talking about their families. How could Ryan do this? Her hands trembled as she backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. Her instincts screamed at her to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to forget what she had heard. After all, what business did a waitress have interfering in the affairs of billionaires? But something inside her refused to let it go. Could she really just stand by and watch an innocent man get ruined? A man who had been nothing but kind to the restaurant staff, always polite, always tipping generously, always thanking them personally. She hesitated in the kitchen, gripping the edges of the metal counter as a wave of uncertainty crashed over her. What if Ryan finds out? What if I lose my job? But then she imagined David, oblivious, sitting at that table, about to sign away everything he had built. And in that moment, she made her decision. As David returned to the table, Emily swallowed her fear and approached him. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her palms damp with nerves. "Mr. Kensington," she said quietly, barely above a whisper. David looked up, surprised. "Yes." She hesitated for only a second. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." David arched an eyebrow, glancing at Ryan, who had just ended his call and was now watching them with mild curiosity. Emily's stomach twisted. "Privately," she added. David frowned but nodded. "Of course." He stood, leading her a few steps away from the table. "What is this about?" Emily took a deep breath. I overheard something just now. Your friend, Ryan, he was on the phone." She swallowed hard. "He said that once you sign the deal, he's taking over. He's planning to take everything from you." David blinked, as if struggling to process what she had just said. "I'm sorry." What? She twisted her hands together. I know this isn't my place, but I swear I heard him say it. He said you wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. He's planning to cut you out of the company completely. David stared at her, his face unreadable. You're absolutely sure about this? Emily nodded. I would never lie about something like this. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his gaze shifted slightly, over her shoulder, toward the table where Ryan sat, sipping his wine, as if he hadn't just plotted his best friend's downfall. David's mind was racing. It was impossible, wasn't it? Ryan was his closest friend, his partner. He had trusted him with everything. And yet, something about Emily's urgency, the raw honesty in her voice, made it impossible to ignore. Slowly, he turned back to her. Thank you for telling me this. Emily exhaled, relief washing over her. What are you going to do? David's expression hardened, his mind already moving at lightning speed. I need to be sure before I act. But if you're right. His jaw tightened. Then Ryan has no idea what's coming. As he walked back toward the table, Emily watched him go, a pit forming in her stomach. She had done what she could. Now, it was up to him. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The calm before the storm. David Kensington returned to the table, his face a carefully crafted mask of composure, though inside, his thoughts were anything but calm. He slid into his chair across from Ryan, who seemed completely at ease, swirling his wine glass and offering an easy grin. You were gone for a while, Ryan remarked casually, glancing at his watch. Everything all right? David nodded, picking up his own glass, using it as a shield while he studied the man across from him. He knew Ryan well, perhaps too well. The confidence in his smirk, the relaxed posture, the casual way he flipped his phone screen down on the table, everything about him screamed comfort. Does he truly believe I'm that blind? David thought bitterly. Has he been planning this for so long that he thinks I would never suspect him? The weight of Emily's words pressed against his mind. He's planning to take everything from you. David wasn't naive. He had spent years in high-stakes business negotiations, reading people, predicting their moves before they made them. He had always believed that his ability to trust the right people had been his greatest asset. But now, that very trust had become his greatest liability. He forced a smile. Just got caught up for a moment, he replied smoothly. You know how it is. Too much going on at once. Ryan nodded, sipping his wine. That's why we need to finalize this deal. Lock things in while we still have the advantage. David feigned interest. Remind me again, what happens if we push back the signing a couple of weeks? Just a hypothetical. Ryan barely hesitated, but David caught it. A fraction of a second, a tiny flicker in his expression before he recovered. Not ideal, Ryan admitted. Delays create uncertainty, which could make our investors nervous. You know how these things go, Dave. The sooner we close, the better. For you, maybe. David nodded, pretending to consider. You're right, he said, setting down his glass. Let's talk again in the morning. I want to go over a few last-minute details. Ryan's jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected that. He had expected David to sign tonight. But he recovered quickly, flashing another grin. Sounds good. I'll have the paperwork ready. David let the conversation drift toward lighter topics, keeping his guard up as Ryan laughed and joked about old times. But the more he watched him, the clearer it became. Ryan had been playing him for a fool. The realization settled in David's chest like lead. By the time the dinner ended, Ryan had no idea that David was already planning his next move. A plan in motion. Later that night, David sat alone in his penthouse apartment, the city skyline glowing through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. A half-finished whiskey sat beside him, untouched. His phone lay on the table, screen lit with the number he had just dialed. Julian, David said as soon as the call connected. I need you. Julian Carter had been David's go-to private investigator for years, a man who operated in the gray areas of legality with quiet precision. He was sharp, ruthless when necessary, and most importantly, discreet. "You sound tense," Julian replied, his voice calm but alert. "What's going on?" David inhaled deeply, staring at the swirling amber liquid in his glass. "I think my business partner is trying to steal the company from under me." Julian didn't respond right away. Then, a slow exhale. "That's a hell of an accusation. What do you need me to do?" "Find proof," David said simply. "I need every detail, every conversation, every financial move he's made in the past 6 months. If he's planning something, I want to know before he makes his move." Julian was silent for a moment. "You're sure about this?" David's jaw clenched. "I trusted him with everything, Julian. If I'm wrong, I'll deal with it. But if I'm right..." He let the implication hang in the air. "All right," Julian said. "I'll get started tonight. If he's covering his tracks, it might take a few days. I'll be in touch." David ended the call and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. The exhaustion was creeping in, but sleep was out of the question. His mind was racing, planning, preparing. Ryan had played his game well. But David was about to change the rules. Emily's dilemma. Emily Carter sat at the small kitchen table in her tiny apartment, staring at the cup of coffee in front of her. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about what she had done, what she had told David. Did I just ruin my own life? It was one thing to overhear a conversation. It was another to step into the world of billionaires and business empires and throw herself in the middle of it. She had been terrified when she spoke to David, but the look on his face had convinced her that she had done the right thing. Still, doubt gnawed at her. What if he didn't believe her? What if Ryan found out she had warned him? Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Keep your head down, Emily. People like us don't get involved in rich people's problems." But this wasn't just a rich person's problem. It was a betrayal, a lie, a scheme that could destroy a man's entire life's work. And Emily had seen enough unfairness in her life to know she couldn't just look away. Her phone buzzed, yanking her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Hello, Emily Carter." A deep male voice, unfamiliar. She stiffened. "Who's asking?" A pause. Then, "My name is Julian Carter. I work with David Kensington." Emily's grip tightened on the phone. "Oh. Listen, I know you already spoke with David, and I know what you overheard," Julian continued. "But I need to ask, are you sure you heard exactly what you think you heard?" Emily swallowed hard. "I know what I heard." "Good," Julian said. "Because if you're right, this is bigger than you think." Emily sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" Julian sighed. "If Ryan's making a move, he's not doing it alone. This isn't just a backstabbing between friends. It's a coup, a hostile takeover. And if that's the case, we need every bit of leverage we can get." Emily's heartbeat quickened. She had only meant to warn David, not get involved in a corporate war. "What do you need from me?" she asked. There was a brief pause, then Julian's voice lowered. "Everything you remember, every detail of that conversation. If you noticed anything about Ryan's behavior that seemed off." Emily inhaled deeply. "I'm already in this. Might as well see it through." "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need." The game begins. David arrived at his office the next morning, already bracing for what lay ahead. His company's future was hanging by a thread, but Ryan had no idea that David was already working against him. As he stepped into his private office, his assistant handed him a folder. "A courier just dropped this off for you, Mr. Kensington." David frowned, opening the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of a contract, a revised contract. And next to David's name, where Ryan's signature was supposed to go, was someone else's. David's breath caught in his throat. It was signed by a third party, a name he recognized. An outsider, A competitor. Someone who should have had nothing to do with their deal. David's pulse pounded in his ears. Ryan wasn't just planning to take over. He had already started. The betrayal unfolds. David Kensington stood in his private office, the sleek, glass-paneled room offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. But he barely noticed the towering buildings or the shimmering lights below. His attention was fixated on the document in his hands. A revised contract. A third-party's signature where Ryan's should have been. Someone else was already involved in the deal, a major player from one of their largest competitors, Montgomery Holdings. David felt his pulse hammering. His breath came in slow, measured exhales as he stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. Jonathan Montgomery. That name alone sent a cold wave of realization through his chest. Montgomery Holdings was a ruthless conglomerate known for hostile takeovers. The company had a history of acquiring struggling businesses, gutting them, and selling off the remains to the highest bidder. But Kensington and Callaway Enterprises wasn't struggling. So why was Montgomery involved? Then the answer hit him like a freight train. Ryan wasn't just planning to take over the company. He was planning to sell it out from under him. David's fingers clenched around the paper. How long has this been in motion? His mind raced, piecing together every small inconsistency he had ignored, every time Ryan had been evasive about their finances. The missing numbers, the suspicious overseas meetings, the urgency to close the deal quickly. It was all coming together now. Ryan had been working behind the scenes with Montgomery Holdings for months, setting up the perfect betrayal. If David had signed the contract yesterday, as planned, he would have unknowingly handed over the majority stake of his company to Montgomery. Ryan would have walked away with a fortune, leaving David with nothing. A betrayal so carefully orchestrated, so deeply personal, it made David's stomach twist with rage. Not this time, Ryan. You won't win this. He picked up his phone and dialed Julian Carter, his private investigator. Julian answered on the second ring. "Tell me you have something," David said without preamble. "I have more than something," Julian replied. Ryan's been funneling money into offshore accounts for the past 10 months. Small, careful withdrawals that didn't raise flags initially. He's been accumulating enough to secure a cushy exit plan. But get this, he's not just planning to leave. He's setting up a new investment firm with Montgomery Holdings backing him. David's grip tightened around his phone. So, he's not just selling me out. He's using my own company as his stepping stone. Exactly, Julian confirmed. And Montgomery is only too happy to help him do it. They stand to gain millions if this deal goes through. They'll strip your company for parts, sell off the most valuable assets, and use Ryan as their figurehead for future acquisitions. David ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "We need to stop this before it happens." "I have one more thing," Julian added. "Your waitress friend, Emily. She was right. I cross-checked her story, and Ryan did make that phone call from the restaurant that night. He's getting cocky. He doesn't think you're onto him." David set his jaw. Then it's time to show him just how wrong he is. The counterattack begins. David wasted no time. Within the hour, he had assembled his legal team in his private conference room. "This is the revised contract Ryan was planning to get me to sign," he said, tossing the document onto the table. His lead attorney, Mark Delaney, skimmed the pages before glancing up sharply. "This is bad. Really bad." David nodded. "I need every possible loophole. Any way to freeze this before Montgomery Holdings gets a grip on my company." Mark adjusted his glasses. "We can issue an immediate injunction. Legally, Ryan doesn't have sole authority to execute this deal without your consent, even if he's manipulated the shares. We need to act fast. I want every bank account, every offshore transfer, every transaction linked to him locked down," David continued. "I want him legally paralyzed before he even realizes what's happening." Mark nodded. "Consider it done." David's mind was already moving to the next step. "I also want a meeting set with Montgomery Holdings. If they think they're getting my company, I want them to hear it from me personally." A few of the attorneys exchanged wary glances. "Are you sure about that, David?" one of them asked. "Montgomery is ruthless." David's expression hardened. "So am I." Emily's unexpected role. Meanwhile, Emily Carter sat at the small cafe near her apartment, nursing a cup of coffee. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the call she had received that morning. David had reached out again, and this time he needed her help. She still wasn't sure why. She was just a waitress, a nobody in the grand scheme of corporate warfare, but David had insisted she meet with him later that evening. The idea terrified her. What if I make things worse? A chair scraped against the floor, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Julian Carter, David's private investigator, sitting across from her. "David sent me," he said without preamble. "He said you might be feeling hesitant." Emily wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I just don't understand what I can do." "I already told him what I heard." Julian studied her for a long moment. "Do you know why he trusts you?" Emily shook her head. "Because you have no reason to lie to him," Julian said simply. "Ryan and the people he's dealing with, they're surrounded by yes men. People who say what they want to hear because they're either on the payroll or too scared to stand up to them. But you risk your job to warn him. That means something." Emily's stomach twisted with uncertainty. "And what does he need me to do?" Julian leaned in. "Ryan doesn't know you're involved yet. That makes you the perfect person to gather more information." Emily's breath caught. "You want me to spy on him?" Julian smirked. "Not spy. Just be in the right place at the right time. The restaurant is one of the only places where Ryan lets his guard down. If he's planning anything else, we need to know before he moves." Emily hesitated. This wasn't just overhearing a conversation anymore. This was stepping directly into the fire. But then she thought about David, about how calm and kind he had been even when she first warned him, about how much trust he was putting in her now. She took a deep breath. "All right, I'll do it." Julian's smirk widened. "I knew you would." The confrontation with Montgomery Holdings. The following afternoon, David walked into the towering headquarters of Montgomery Holdings, his every step purposeful. Jonathan Montgomery sat at the head of a long conference table, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that had seen countless business battles. "You requested a meeting," Montgomery said smoothly, folding his hands together. "What can I do for you, Mr. Kensington?" David placed the revised contract on the table. "This deal, it's not happening." Montgomery barely glanced at it. "I don't think you understand, David. The paperwork is nearly finalized. Ryan assured me everything would proceed smoothly." David's eyes darkened. "Ryan doesn't have the authority to sell my company." Montgomery exhaled, feigning disappointment. "A shame. It would have been a lucrative arrangement." David leaned forward. "Walk away from this deal now, because if you don't, I promise you, the moment you try to execute this contract, I will personally ensure that Kensington and Calloway takes you and Ryan to court. And I guarantee you, by the time it's over, your firm's reputation will be in the gutter." Montgomery studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smirked. "You really are your father's son." David's jaw tightened. "Then you know I don't lose." Montgomery chuckled. "Very well. Consider our deal postponed." David didn't relax. He knew Montgomery well enough to know that this wasn't over. But for now, Ryan's greatest ally had just been neutralized, and it was time to deal with Ryan himself. The hunter becomes the hunted. David Kensington stepped out of Montgomery Holdings' towering glass skyscraper, the sharp winter wind biting against his skin as he pulled his coat tighter. His conversation with Jonathan Montgomery had been tense, but he had made his point. The deal between Ryan and Montgomery Holdings was dead, for now. But he wasn't foolish enough to believe it was over. Montgomery was a predator, a businessman who thrived in hostile takeovers and corporate destruction. If he had already sunk his claws into Ryan, He wasn't going to let go so easily. David exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. He had stopped one attack, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. Ryan Calloway was still out there, still scheming, and if David knew him as well as he thought he did, he wouldn't go down without a fight. He needed to hit him first. Hard. A hidden threat in plain sight. Emily Carter adjusted her black apron, keeping her posture casual as she moved through the busy restaurant. The restaurant where she worked was high-end, known for its discretion and privacy. She had learned early on that some of the city's most powerful people did business deals over expensive steaks and wine. It was how she had first overheard Ryan's betrayal. And now she was here again, this time intentionally listening. Julian had told her Ryan didn't know she was involved, which meant she had a unique advantage. As far as Ryan was concerned, she was just another invisible waitress in the background. And tonight, she was in the perfect position. Ryan was sitting in his usual booth at the back of the restaurant, his back to the wall, his phone in hand. Across from him sat a tall, sharp-dressed man in a gray suit. She didn't recognize him, but something about him screamed corporate shark. She moved closer, pretending to wipe down an empty table nearby. Her heart pounded as she tried to catch snippets of their conversation over the noise of the restaurant. "Montgomery is out," Ryan was saying, his voice tense. Kensington made sure of it. The man in the gray suit didn't look surprised. "I told you this would happen. You should have moved faster." Ryan scowled. "I was careful. I had everything lined up." He wasn't supposed to catch on this quickly. The man sighed, taking a sip of his wine. "David Kensington isn't stupid. You knew that." Emily's stomach twisted. They weren't giving up. Ryan was already looking for another way. "Fine," Ryan muttered. "Montgomery is out. But that just means we need a new partner." The man raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly do you think is willing to step into this mess?" Ryan smirked. "Leave that to me." Emily knew she had heard enough. She turned on her heel, heading toward the back of the restaurant, her hands shaking. She needed to get this information to David. Ryan isn't finished. He's planning something bigger. She barely made it through the kitchen doors when she heard a voice behind her. Emily. Her blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Ryan was standing a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes locked onto her. An unseen collision course. David Kensington had barely returned to his office when Julian Carter called. "We have a problem," Julian said. David frowned, setting down his briefcase. "What kind of problem?" "Your waitress, Emily. I sent her in to gather intel on Ryan. She overheard something big. He's already looking for a new buyer." David's fingers tightened around his phone. "Who?" "Not sure yet," Julian admitted. "But that's not the problem." David's heart sank. "Then what is?" Julian hesitated. "Ryan made her." He caught her listening. David's blood ran cold. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Julian said grimly. "We need to get to her before he does." Emily's gamble. Emily's heart pounded so hard she was sure Ryan could hear it. He was watching her too closely. She tried to keep her expression neutral, her hands at her sides. I was just heading back to the kitchen," she said, keeping her voice steady. Ryan tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" Her pulse hammered against her ribs. "Don't panic. Don't run. I didn't realize you were in the middle of a meeting," she added quickly. "I was just clearing tables." Ryan studied her for a long moment. His eyes, which had once seemed so warm when he was sitting next to David, were ice cold now. For a second, she thought she was safe. Then, he grabbed her wrist. She gasped, jerking slightly, but his grip was like steel. "You've been watching me," he said quietly. Emily's mind raced. What?" "No." Ryan's grip tightened. "You were listening," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Emily forced herself to stay calm. "You're mistaken," she said carefully. "I was just working." Ryan leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. "You're not as invisible as you think." Emily's stomach twisted. He knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew. She yanked her wrist free. "I have work to do," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Then she turned and walked away, keeping her pace even. She didn't let herself run. But the moment she was out of sight, she pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Julian. "Ryan knows." The showdown. David had never driven so fast in his life. Julian had already called in extra security. Emily was on her way to David's office, and every second felt like an eternity. By the time she walked through the doors, pale but unharmed, David felt his chest loosen just slightly. "You're okay?" he asked. Emily nodded. "But Ryan knows I was listening." David exhaled. "Then he's desperate." Julian stepped forward. "We have enough to shut him down. He's running out of moves. The question is, how do you want to handle this?" David's jaw tightened. "We end this." He turned to Emily. "And you? Are you still in?" Emily hesitated for only a second. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "I'm in." David nodded. Then he picked up his phone and called Ryan. The moment his former best friend answered, David's voice was cold as steel. "You wanted a war, Ryan," he said. "Then you've got one. The final betrayal. A war begins." David Kensington's hand tightened around his phone as he listened to the silence on the other end. He had just delivered his message, one that left no room for misinterpretation. "You wanted a war, Ryan. Then you've got one." The pause before Ryan spoke was long. Too long. Then, finally, a quiet chuckle. "David." Ryan's voice oozed false amusement, but there was an edge to it, like a man cornered. "I was wondering when you'd finally call me." David's grip on the phone didn't loosen. "I gave you everything, Ryan. I trusted you. And you tried to take it all." "That's one way to look at it," Ryan said. "Another way is that I was doing what you never had the guts to do, playing the game to win." David exhaled sharply, his anger burning. "You're done, Ryan. I know about Montgomery. I know about the offshore accounts. And I know you're already looking for another buyer." Ryan was silent. David continued, his voice colder than it had ever been. "I've already moved against you. Your accounts are frozen. Montgomery has backed off. And by the end of the day, you won't have a single investor left." Ryan's voice was calm, but David could hear the strain behind it. "You think you've won." David smirked. "I know I have." Another long pause. Then Ryan spoke again, his tone shifting from arrogance to something darker. "All right, David, you want to play rough. Let's play rough." The call ended. David set his phone down. That, he said to Julian, who had been listening nearby, was a threat. Julian nodded grimly. "Yeah. And I don't like it." David turned to Emily, who was standing by the window, still shaken from her encounter with Ryan at the restaurant. "You need protection," he said firmly. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Julian cut her off. "He's right. Ryan's dangerous when he's desperate. And right now, he's got nothing to lose." Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. David ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Ryan wasn't going to sit back and let everything collapse around him. He was going to make a move, and David had to be ready. Ryan's next move. Ryan Calloway sat in his high-rise apartment, his mind spinning as he poured himself a drink. The whiskey burned as it slid down his throat, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside him. He had underestimated David. He had thought he could manipulate him, string him along until the deal was signed, then quietly take everything. But David had outmaneuvered him, and now everything was falling apart. His accounts were frozen. His deal with Montgomery Holdings was dead. His position in the company was slipping through his fingers like sand. David thinks he's won. Ryan set his glass down with a sharp clink. "But I'm not out yet." He picked up his phone and dialed a number. A few seconds later, a voice answered. "Ryan, we need to talk." Ryan said, his voice sharp. I need something big, something that will take David down before he finishes me off. The voice on the other end chuckled. I was wondering when you'd call. I might have just the thing. Ryan leaned forward, his eyes dark. Tell me. A devastating blow. The next morning, David arrived at his office early, feeling cautiously optimistic. His legal team had confirmed that Ryan's access to the company's accounts had been revoked. Every loophole had been closed. By lunchtime, Ryan would be out of moves. But just as he was settling into his desk, his assistant, Sarah, rushed in, her face pale. Mr. Kensington, she said breathlessly. You need to see this. David frowned. What is it? Wordlessly, Sarah set her tablet on his desk and pressed play on a video. David's blood ran cold. It was a news broadcast, and the headline across the screen read, Kensington Empire under investigation. Allegations of fraud and illegal dealings. David's stomach twisted as the reporter spoke. Breaking news today as Kensington and Callaway Enterprises faces allegations of financial fraud. A confidential source has provided documents suggesting that CEO David Kensington has been involved in offshore dealings to avoid corporate taxes and manipulate stock prices. David barely heard the rest. His mind was spinning. This was Ryan. This was his counterattack. It was a lie. But in the world of business, sometimes a lie was just as damaging as the truth. David looked up at Julian, who had just walked into the office and seen the same report. Ryan just hit back, David said, his voice low with fury. Julian nodded, his jaw clenched. And he hit hard. David stood, his entire body taut with anger. Get me my PR team. Get me my lawyers. And get me Ryan Callaway. Emily's fear and determination. Emily watched the news in horror. She knew it wasn't true. David wasn't the kind of man to engage in fraud or offshore schemes, but the media didn't care about the truth. Ryan had just made his move, and it was a brutal one. Her phone buzzed. A message from Julian. Stay where you are. We're coming to you. She swallowed hard. Then, before she could put her phone down, it buzzed again. A different message. From an unknown number. You should have kept your mouth shut. Emily's blood turned to ice. She stood, backing away from the table in her apartment, her heart pounding. Ryan knew. And now, she was in real danger. The showdown. David stormed into the private club where Ryan had been spotted just an hour ago. He found him sitting in a dimly lit VIP section, sipping whiskey like he didn't have a care in the world. David didn't waste time. He strode straight to Ryan's table and slammed his hands down on it. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, David growled. Ryan didn't even flinch. Relax, David, he said, smirking. It's just business. David leaned in, his voice low and furious. You just accused me of crimes I didn't commit. You're trying to destroy my name, my company. That's not business, Ryan. That's war. Ryan shrugged. And yet, here we are. David's fists clenched. I will bury you for this. Ryan smirked. We'll see about that. The two men locked eyes, years of friendship turning into something venomous. David knew one thing. Ryan had crossed the final line. And now, there was no turning back. The reckoning. A legacy on the line. David Kensington sat in his office, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on him like a steel vise. The storm had hit harder than he expected, and Ryan's smear campaign had sent shockwaves through the financial world. Investors were panicking, stocks were dropping, and the media had turned Kensington and Callaway Enterprises into a battleground. Fraud, offshore accounts, corporate corruption, all lies. And yet, lies were dangerous. Lies could destroy everything. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the flashing red numbers on the stock market screen in front of him. He had spent his entire life building this company, and in less than a day, Ryan had managed to cast doubt over everything he had ever worked for. His phone buzzed on the desk. It was Julian. "Tell me you have something," David said, gripping the receiver. Julian's voice was tense. "I do, but you're not going to like it." David closed his eyes briefly before exhaling. "Just say it." "We traced the leak back to a single journalist, Marcus Hale. Independent, but with deep connections in corporate finance. Here's the kicker. Ryan paid him off, but he also gave him real documents." David sat up. "What?" "Not about you," Julian clarified. "About himself. Ryan set this whole thing up so that it looks like you're the one who was running the offshore accounts. In reality, the transactions he's pinned on you are his. He's just altered the names." David felt his blood boil. "That son of a—" "It gets worse," Julian cut in. "Ryan didn't just frame you. He's planning to sell this fake evidence to the SEC. If they open a full-scale investigation, even though you're innocent, it could take years to clear your name." David clenched his jaw. "He's trying to drown me in bureaucracy while he walks away with the company." "Exactly," Julian confirmed. "You need to move fast." David's mind raced. He had been playing defense, but that wasn't going to work anymore. It was time to go on the attack. "Julian," David said, his voice like steel, "I want Ryan destroyed. I want everything. His accounts, his offshore dealings, every single shady move he's made, exposed. And I want the world to know." Julian was silent for a moment before replying. "I thought you'd never ask." Emily in the crosshairs. Meanwhile, Emily Carter sat in her apartment, gripping her phone as she read the text message again. "You should have kept your mouth shut." She had been expecting something like this, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. Julian had warned her to stay put, but she knew that wasn't going to be enough. Ryan was ruthless, and now that he knew she had been helping David, she wasn't just a problem. She was a liability. A knock at the door made her jump. Her heart pounded as she slowly approached. "Who is it?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emily, it's me, David." She exhaled in relief and quickly unlocked the door. David stepped inside, his face set in a grim expression. He wasn't alone. 2 men in suits followed behind him. Security. "You're coming with me," David said without preamble. Emily frowned. "What? Why?" "Because Ryan isn't just playing games anymore," David said, his blue eyes hard. "He's making threats." Emily hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," David interrupted. "You helped me when you didn't have to. Now it's my turn to help you." Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. She grabbed her bag and followed him out the door. She had no idea how deep this war would go. Ryan's desperation. Ryan Calloway sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the mahogany surface. The smear campaign was working. David's company was in turmoil, and the public was eating up the headlines. But something didn't feel right. David hadn't responded. Ryan had expected a press conference, a legal rebuttal, maybe even an attempt at damage control. But instead, there had been silence. That wasn't like David. A sinking feeling settled in Ryan's gut. His phone buzzed. He answered it without hesitation. "Tell me you have good news." "Not exactly," came a voice on the other end. It was one of his informants. "David's legal team just filed an emergency motion against you. They're challenging the entire fraud case." Ryan clenched his jaw. "So what?" "It'll take weeks before anything actually moves through the courts." There was a pause. "That's not all," the informant continued. "They also sent the real offshore documents to the SEC. The ones with your name on them." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. "What?" He snapped. "They traced everything back to you," the man said. "Every illegal transfer, every manipulated account. They're putting it all out there." Ryan shot up from his chair, knocking over a glass of whiskey. "That's impossible." "No," the voice on the other end said coldly. It's checkmate. The final confrontation. David stood in the boardroom of Kensington and Callaway Enterprises, his hands in his pockets as he waited. The door opened. Ryan walked in. For a brief moment, David saw the man he had once called his best friend, the man he had built an empire with, the man he had trusted. That man was gone. Ryan's expression was tight, but he was trying to mask his anger. "I assume you brought me here for a reason." David nodded. "I did." He tossed a folder onto the conference table. Ryan hesitated before picking it up. As he flipped through the pages, his face paled. Bank statements, transfers, a timeline of offshore dealings. His offshore dealings. "How did you?" Ryan stopped himself, his jaw tightening. "You were sloppy," David said simply. "You thought you could pin everything on me, but you forgot one thing." Ryan glared at him. "And what's that?" David leaned forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "I never lose." Ryan slammed the folder shut. "You think this is enough? The media's already running my version of the story. You can't stop the machine once it's in motion." David smirked. "I don't have to." Ryan frowned. David slid his phone across the table and hit play. A voice filled the room. Ryan's voice. "David has no clue. Once the deal goes through, I'll have control of everything." Ryan's face went pale. Emily had recorded him. The room was silent. David stood. "By now, the SEC has everything they need. The media will get the full story within the hour. Your name will be attached to this scandal forever. You'll never work in finance again." Ryan's fists clenched, his face twisted with rage. "You bastard." David stepped closer. "You did this to yourself." Ryan's nostrils flared, but he knew it was over. "Security will escort you out," David said. "And I suggest you get a good lawyer." Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. David exhaled, finally feeling the weight of the last few weeks lifting off his shoulders. It was over. Ryan was finished, and Kensington and Callaway Enterprises was safe. A new beginning. A week later, Emily stood in David's office, looking out over the city skyline. "You did it," she said softly. David smiled. "We did it." Emily turned to him. "So, what happens now?" David leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "Now, I make sure the company never faces a threat like this again." Emily hesitated. "And me." David studied her for a long moment. "You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life," he said. "I'd like to return the favor." He slid a document toward her. She frowned, picking it up. Her eyes widened. "A full-ride scholarship." David smiled. "Time to finish what you started, Emily." Her eyes filled with tears. "I thank you." "You earned it," David said simply. As Emily looked down at the paper in her hands, she realized something. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of something new. For both of them.